Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
There are some things you never need to teach a child. And one of them is the phrase, "it's not fair." I mean, imagine how difficult that phrase, it's a very complex idea. Imagine how hard it would be to teach a child if they didn't have an eerie, uncanny way of understanding it right from the start. And another thing you never have to teach a child is metaphor. Metaphor as a way of thinking, as a stance of the mind, is where children seem to dwell happily. But ours is an age which suffers the intellectual paralysis of a deadly literalism, where only what is measured, costed, counted, and accounted is considered valuable. And in contrast to this, children are musicians of thought. They transpose from the key of fact to the key of magic through metaphor. It's part of the free play of the mind, a requisite for the individual child and essential to art. Playfully taking a line for a walk, playing on words, photographing the play of light, playing a violin, playing with an idea, writing a play. The playfulness within the artistic process is unquestionable. By contrast, children using too much commodified play of toys and products are learning a terrible lesson that they have a scarcity within them, that they cannot provide for their own play or rely on their own imaginations, that they are the impoverished beggars of the entertainment industry and, of course, their own parents. Unscheduled, spontaneous play improvises, because when it comes to the living of one's life, there is no dress rehearsal. Let me give you an overview of Kith. There is a crisis of childhood, which so many people, parents, teachers, all those of us who care about society can see. In 2007, in a UNICEF report, Britain ranked lowest of 21 industrialized nations for childhood well-being. The United Nations refers to a general climate of intolerance towards young people. Children and young people are telling us in every language they know that they're unhappy, from riots to depression, from dangerous gang behavior to self-harm. Kith is not a parenting manual. It's about the big picture. It's about how societies as a whole treat their children. And there are huge differences in how childhood is experienced in indigenous cultures, which interests me deeply. My book explores children's affinity for the natural world, the quest element of childhood, issues of childhood privacy and surveillance, children's relationships with pets, and the profound politics of childhood. If there is one word which seems to sum up the treatment of children today, it is enclosure. We've enclosed them with fear, with surveillance, and enclosed them in rigid schedules of time. These enclosures compound each other, make children bitterly unhappy. And in 2011, UNICEF asked children what they needed to be happy. And in the top 3 things, yearningly, they said, outdoors. Now, partly, obviously, this is an issue of car culture. Society as a whole has to start addressing the fact that there are needs other than the needs of car drivers, that children have needs too, and for urban children, that includes supporting the many attempts to create safer streets. And partly, contemporary enclosure is a result of the risk-averse society. Tree climbing is unsafe, say some teachers, and yes, indeed, 1,067 British children were hospitalized for falling out of trees in 2006 to 2007, but more than twice as many, 2,532, were hospitalized for falling out of bed. But tightly constrained by a risk-averse, health and safety-obsessed society, many children are unable to light fires, paddle canoes, build shelters, use knives or cope with darkness. But rather than learning to trust their own judgment, children are taught to obey the signs of the authorities at every turn. So barriers, I've seen this, barriers erected around a Guy Fawkes bonfire had notices saying, "Danger, stand back," as if the children had to take their orders from the signage and not from the fact that there's a blazing pyre melting their wellies. But this is about something far more serious than living in a culture where people are ready to sue at the drop of a hat. It's about insidiously demanding that children must always seek permission for the most trivial of actions, that they must always obey the commands of others at every turn. Children today are not being beaten into obedience so much as being eroded into it. And the risk-averse society creates a docility and a loss of autonomy, which has a horrible political shadow, a populace malleable, commandable, and obedient. Because in childhood, the boundary is quivering. Children are liminal. The door is ajar. It opens easily on the hinges. The paw is scraping at the gate. The hoof is there, inside the shoe. Children make friends with animals. They tell secrets to animals. They feel understood by them. But animals are important for children in a further sense. They're guides to thought. Wondering what a wasp is thinking or what a snail might feel in the wind is part of the mind's development, practicing that quick spring of empathy. So crucial are animals for children's happiness that in one UNICEF survey in 2007, children specified that pets were one of the top 4 most important things for their happiness. Top of the list in the UNICEF survey that children said they needed to be happy was time. Time to think, time to play, time to daydream. And if I could nominate the guardian angel of reverie, it would have to be Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher and 20th century romantic, who wrote, "In our childhood, reverie gave us freedom. We still dream of liberty as we dreamt of it as children." But children need wild, unlimited time. Though many are diarized into wall-to-wall activities, they're scheduled from the moment they wake to the moment they sleep. Every hour accounted for by parents whose actions are prompted by the fear that their child may be left behind in a rat race which begins in the nursery. If these generations of children are too often exiled from the natural world, they lose the sense of wild time, the significance of the seasons. So spring and its sole values of expectation, exploration, possibility, summer and its sole values of pleasure, autumn and generosity, and winter, which speaks of endurance, how to resist the frosts, how to survive in style, defiantly burning the candles in midwinter. Historically, in Britain, through Puritanism and Methodism, breaking the will of a child was considered essential to child rearing. But when I was looking at indigenous cultures' ideas of childhood, one very common theme was the importance of respecting the child's will. Will is a life force for children. Will is vitality. It's the iridescent juice which makes the spirit shine. So Kung children of the Kalahari, for instance, were not customarily forced into obedience. If they strongly refused to do something, the choice was considered theirs to make. Among the Yacana people of Venezuela, coercion was traditionally absent. Deciding what anyone else should do was absent from their philosophy. Take a step back for a moment. Letting children have their own way doing just what they like? Wouldn't that be a total disaster? Well, yes, if parents perform only the first half of the trick. Because self-will is often understood as a kind of brattish, selfish behavior, children acting like spoiled gods. But will does not mean selfishness. For often, when Indigenous people have elaborated on the importance of a child's will being respected, they stress wider social subtleties. And this is the second half of the trick. That children are socialized into awareness for the will of others and the autonomy of the community. So an individual may learn that they have to rein in their own will, but crucially not be compelled to do that by somebody else. The traditional Inuit upbringing made children into self-reliant, caring, and self-controlled individuals. Those who would still overrule a child's will often take obedience as their watchword, as they fear disobedience and disorder, believing that if a child is not controlled, there will be chaos. But to me, these are false opposites, because the true opposite of obedience is not disobedience, it's independence. The true opposite of order is not disorder, but freedom. And the true opposite of control is not chaos, but self-control. My chapters on education in my book look at the brilliant effects of things like forest schools, the Reggio Emilia system in Italy, the wonderful work of Anthony Seldon. Out of it all, though, it seems to me that there is one clear voice in the education debate that must be listened to. That one clear voice is the voice of Michael Gove. He is so helpful because whatever he says gives parents and teachers very clear guidelines to aim for the complete opposite. He wants regimentation and the authoritarian teacher. Good teachers know that children learn very well from each other and from their own guesses and mistakes. He wants longer school hours, while teachers and children know that they learn so much also in their free time. Gove wants endless assessments and tests. Good teachers and children know that education doesn't work well that way, but rather works through honoring the way that children actually think. Because, and this would probably shock Michael Gove, children like learning. When they say, let's pretend, I've got an idea, I know, did you know? They are galvanized by curiosity. Why is the question that really appeals to children. They are metaphysicians of why before they're pragmatists of what and where and when. And if many teenagers today seem lost to themselves in mental illness or drug and alcohol abuse, it's perhaps because young people are given no chance of a meaningful quest, no rites of passage, neither the twisted anti-heroic rituals of drug abuse and self-harm, nor the bland grades and assessments of exams and driving tests fit the bill. We know that children need attention. They also need privacy. And it seems to me that the constant surveillance which young people suffer and the aggressive staring of adults is particularly bad for them. Staring is a predatory act amongst all mammals, including humans. And teenagers rightly hate it. The fashion for hoodies arose at about the same time as increasing surveillance. And I once asked one of my favorite hoodies if one of the reasons he liked wearing it was to protect himself from invasive adult staring. Emphatically, he said, yes. Some people use the word romantic as an insult, suggesting sentimentality. It's ignorant and it's dishonest. The historical romantics championed childhood in a way which was ferociously political, fighting against years of belief in original sin, represented, for instance, by one Puritan minister who referred to babies as filthy, guilty, odious, and abominable babies. Romanticism was not merely a historical movement in culture, but rather a perennial truth about the human mind. Romanticism comprehended authentic human nature and saw how that spirit was being brutalized in childhood. And it seems to me the same is true today. What Romanticism understands, and I use the present tense because it is a perennial need of the human spirit, what Romanticism understands includes passion, imagination, heroism, a sense of justice and the quest, a desire for the authentic, a will towards self-determination and freedom, an innate love of nature, metaphoric thinking. Because children are filthy little romantics, and childhood itself is the quintessential romanticism. But wider society also needs the romance of childhood for its very creativity, requiring the reckless rapture of the eternal child within culture, whose incandescence must be tended and attended to, so that its light can flare in the storyteller, the artist, the dancer, so that the risk-taking, anarchic and flame-like quality, the eternal return of the great romance of childhood, which exists within us all, can flame in a resurgent, romantic revolution. Thank you.
The issues of childhood clearly sit within a much larger social malaise, I think, which we can identify in all sorts of ways, a perfect storm of surveillance, health and safety, the endless pressures of the new financial capitalism and so on. It seems to me this issue of fear and guilt around the parental, and the parental, if you like, stands in for the larger societal structure as well, as to when somebody might make the first move to shift this in a more collective sense. You know, if I'm the only parent on the street who lets my child play outside, and if anything happens... And we've all been in that situation, I think, any of us who have been looking after children. Your book's not a manual by any means, and it's a much larger imaginative reading of the whole situation. But what do you think about this key point, about how we make shifts in this psychology of fear and guilt?
I think one of the things that really pleased me when I was on Start the Week a couple of weeks ago, and a friend of mine told me that her 12-year-old daughter listened to me on Start the Week on the radio and was nodding and agreeing with everything that I said. And later that day, she lives in Brixton, it's like, you know, totally urban environment. And later that day, she decided she was going to round up some friends and they were going to go out together and play on the street, not in the road, not with the cars, but on the pavement. And I think that kind of thing is really important, you know, that children themselves, in groups, can be remarkably safe. You know, obviously nobody wants to feel that their child is the only child kind of, you know, out alone. It's too vulnerable for the child, it's too frightening for the parents. But children historically have always gone around together in groups, you know, the slightly older looking after the slightly younger. I also think all the issues of kind of, you know, very, very powerful community-initiated responses to road safety, of kind of pedestrianised streets, of the 20s Plenty campaign, those things are absolutely crucial, is to say that our priorities in society cannot only be the car driver and the, you know, the accounted for kind of, you know, work time or something of, you know, of the wider society. They have to include the needs of children. What seems to me quite often to happen with parents is that it's when they talk to each other about all sorts of issues, including kind of technology and too much screen time and things like that, you can tell children why too much screen time is bad. You know, and I'm not against technology per se, but, you know, I was very, very interested by some of the results about too much television, for instance, which correlates with measures of body fat, children who watch too much television when they are 4 are more likely to tease and bully their classmates when they're between 6 and 11. Also, what comes with technology, the whole issue of consumerism, which, the products that come with. Consumerism in childhood is known to make children depressed, anxious, and suffer low self-esteem. Again, children don't want those effects. And I think it can explain to children why, reduced amounts of screen time are a good idea.